Alright, so getting started, part 3. This one's gonna be a little bit different than the other two parts. Just so everyone's up to speed before we jump in, parts 1 and 2 were very heavily scripted, so I kind of knew exactly what to edit going into it. Part 3 is going to be way more off the cuff. There's really no script on this one. We're going to be building a supergun, and a supergun is essentially an arcade machine in a box. Now we're going to talk a little bit about where superguns are today, and specifically what kind of supergun this is, but keep in mind, this isn't going to be a tutorial on how exactly to build this exact supergun. It's more so going to be commentary over the build itself and kind of a montage of the entire process. I was actually about halfway through editing part 1 of this Third Strike series when I started building the supergun, and it really didn't click to me until about that point where I said, you know, this would make a pretty interesting part for the video, so I decided to throw on some lights, get the camera ready, and try to film the process. I'm really excited to show you all the events that I was able to take this out to so far, and see all my local players play on the machine too. Stick around after the build, and we're going to talk about going to locals, some tournament advice, improving, and a whole lot more. So if you're ready, let's go ahead and get all the parts out, and let's make something fun. So, after some much needed organization, we're ready to start going through some of our boxes. We have a couple different parts we're going to be using in this build. Some you probably see in other superguns, which we'll talk about soon, some not. So, for our very first part, we have... well, that box wasn't for the build. I'm sorry, you guys kind of weren't supposed to see that one. Moving on, let's just go ahead and get to the next package. If I'm right, this one should be some of our JAMA parts, and, okay. Alright, so, look, I gotta go ahead and organize all this. I'm so sorry. Give me just a minute, and, we'll get back to it. Okay, so, no more jokes, no more theatrics. For real, that last bit was like the only thing that I had scripted for part 3. So like we said, we're gonna be building a supergun, or at least this is kind of a montage of me building the supergun. So superguns in general are kind of a really broad and vague term nowadays. Only maybe about, 10 or 15 years ago, superguns essentially meant like big Japanese control panel style superguns where the power supply and all the controls and the video options were all in this huge panel with like onboard controls. But now you can have superguns that are as small as your smartphone and pack a whole bunch of features in. But namely, if you are building or if you're buying a supergun, they're all going to need the same things to run an arcade PCB. In particular, we're going to be focusing on JAMA games with this supergun, and even more specifically Third Strike, because that's what I'm trying to bring out to some of my local events. So I'm going to be using an arcade-style power supply. Some people, when they do arcade projects, they'll use PC ATX-style power supplies. And I've used those before for projects. I mean, they're fine, but I just vastly prefer using arcade-style power supplies whenever I get the chance, if I'm going to be running arcade boards. We're going to need something to let our players use their controls. So we're going to need something that connects to both the first 3 buttons for player 1 and player 2 on the JAMA harness, and then something extra to hook up to our kick harness, which if you look to the right of my power supply, or I guess underneath the shell now, I've got 2 undammed USB decoders. And I love these little boards so much. These boards are like the future to me. I love these so much. I've talked about it a little bit in part 2, but those undammed decoders are what is going to let our local players use their console USB fight sticks with real arcade hardware. And that is like the beautiful thing that opens up the barrier entry of Third Strike for people that only are comfortable using like DualShocks and Xbox controllers. It's amazing. I love those boards. But yeah, arcade style power supply. I've got a little socket wired up to it now, so we can just use a regular like PC style plug with it. And I never want to test anything on that power supply without having a switch connected to it in some capacity. What I'm doing right now is I'm organizing all of the different looms in the JAMA harness. I mean, really the JAMA harness is just one big loom in and of itself, but I'm just separating powers and grounds and all the different wires for player 1 side, the volume. If you look at those 3 little buttons I have over there on the right, I have 2 little red buttons. I forget the exact diameter number or whatever, but the 2 red buttons are for player 1 coin and for service, and the little bit larger blue button is for test, so I can get to kind of the software menu that's in a lot of different JAMA games, and particularly it is in Third Strike 2. That's what we're concerned about. Oh, yes, and all those extra ones to the left of the JAMA harness, those are some extra wires for extra buttons that I don't particularly need, so those are all kind of bundled up all in one go. That little board up there to the kind of top left, next to that little case full of Molex connectors, that is going to be our video solution. All JAMA boards, or at least most JAMA boards to my knowledge, I'm not an encyclopedia on PCBs by any degree, they all output direct RGB video, and that specific video signal is meant for arcade-style monitors that accept that specific style of RGB signal. Here's the thing. I guess this is probably the most controversial part in this build, I suppose, but I love this little board to death. I've used it in a bunch of other projects and for test bench style stuff. It's a nifty little board. I've actually moved it to kind of the bottom left of the screen now, but the thing with the S-Video and the component and the blue, red, green RCA jacks, that is a JROC video encoder. That's going to take our RGB signal from the PCB, the Third Strike PCB, and allow us to encode that video into a signal that we can safely display on a consumer level CRT TV, like a tube TV. And the thing with this board that I guess not a lot of other people are aware of when they go to build these super guns is that board has an RGB pass-through. RGB is a huge topic nowadays, both for arcade and retro game consoles, and RGB is essentially the best video quality type of signal that you can get for these old machines. It's the absolute best if you're using certain technology, particularly if you're using an OSSC with an HDMI out for a flat screen TV, or if you're using a PVM or a BVM, some of those professional or broadcast video monitors. It is the best solution, but that's not our focus with this super gun. That is a particular safety thing I do want to mention with this, is that we're using the JROC video encoder only for S-Video, component, and composite. The RGB option on here is a pass-through. It doesn't convert or do anything to the RGB signal, so if we were to try to use that RGB pass-through on the JROC with something like a SCART switcher or directly wired up into a PVM or BVM cable, we could damage that hardware very, very badly, and that is not our goal with this. We want to see the game, not blow up the game. So we're going to stick with just component, composite, S-Video, etc. Right now, there's not a whole lot going on, so I was able to take a little time to talk about that video thing. We've painted the bottom half of our shell, and the top half is just patiently waiting in the garage, drying with some paint on it now. Just something to give a little bit of a stylized look. I am no professional painter by any means, but I figured if I'm starting out with a blank case, I may as well try to make something neat looking out of it. So I'm just getting a couple different footprints ready. Before I actually started filming this, I kind of got to this exact stage in the build where I had some things wired up on a different harness and whatnot. And then I decided, this will be fun to put in the video. So I kind of had to pack things back up for showmanship and then restart. So right now I'm in the background looking at a bunch of different Photoshop files that I have where I measured all the parts out and kind of made little blueprint footprints of where I wanted to mount in all the parts, so that way I could test out where things would lie without actually mounting it in. And this part that I'm holding right now, that is a very important part to me. Ooh, but first, new paint job. Isn't that nice? I kind of tried to model it after this little poster for Third Strike. I'll throw it up on the screen. But regardless, I just think it looks cool. But yeah, back up to that little part on the bottom right there, sitting on top of the little plastic case. That is a mixer slash amplifier slash splitter for audio signals. It's a cheap little thing, but I've never really seen those in super guns before. So I thought that was a pretty little neat thing to try to include, particularly because I've been to a couple different tournaments before for a couple different games, both old and new, and I've seen a lot of tournament players talk about this issue that not a lot of setups have audio, either coming through the monitor or options for headphones. So I figured when I was getting some parts together for this, I wanted to give my players that option, because this isn't really a super gun, you know, for me to have at home just to play whatever boards. I'm particularly building this just because I had a lot of parts on hand, or a couple spare parts that I wanted to order on the cheap that I've used before, so I could take this back and forth to events every single week. And that's just something that I wanted, not so much for myself, but for my local players who, you know, maybe take the game a little bit more seriously than I do. I wanted to give them that competitive advantage, I suppose. And right now I'm just marking out a couple different measurements on the front and back panel so I can take it out into the garage, drill a couple holes to mount some ports on there, and ta-da! It's all kind of coming together, huh? I've got my 2 red buttons on the bottom for coin and service. The blue one in the middle is for that test switch like we talked about. I've got 2 little voltage readers on the front there, so I can constantly monitor the 5 and the 12 volt going to our PCB. And on the back, I've got a whole bunch of RCA ports for our video. I've got 2 different component inputs. I've got a composite and 2 different left and right audio channels. I've got that little power socket and the fan that I'm pointing out for some ventilation. And I've got a little hole on that side where our JAMA harness is going to come out of later. All those wires that I'm kind of fiddling with right now, well, really I'm trying to plug in the power socket so I can kind of show it turning on. But most of those wires coming out are our USB extenders, so we can plug them into our undammed decoders. I'm just showing a little power switch powering on. Turned it on, it didn't blow up. That's step 1. Wonderful, wonderful. Flipping it over to the front, and there's our voltage readers. We need to crank down the 5 volts a little bit. It's a little high on there. But regardless, most JAMA PCBs rely on a very stable 5 volt signal, and some are very critical about the 12 volt there. So if the 5 volt gets way too high, bad things can happen. Some boards have an automatic shut off just for safety, and if it gets far too low, you either get like some garbage on the screen, or maybe sometimes it'll have an automatic shut off depending upon, you know, the manufacturer and the board, how it was put together. But in a nutshell, if the 5 volt dips below 5 volts and Third Strike starts to not work, I probably know why. It's just a good troubleshooting thing to have. Right now I am mounting in my undammed decoders, and I've already talked enough about how much I love these little boards. I want to install these in everything that I do in the future. Again, not so much for me, I just play on an arcade stick. I'd be more than happy just building a super gun that has Sanwa controls mounted into it, but it's not just for me. I want more people to play Third Strike, that's the goal. And a little note on those RCA jacks down there. I am a big believer in scavenging and keeping old parts from either broken electronics or past projects and trying to reuse them as much as I can. These RCA jacks were not a good idea. If you take a good look, you might notice that these are like PCB mount style RCA jacks, where they're meant to be, you know, hard soldered on top of a PCB. I took these out of a little video switcher that I had, and I bought for like some retro consoles. And I'll show you this really cool clip from the first event that I actually took the super gun out to, which I really wasn't even intending to take it out to until I did some more testing, but hey, life throws you curveballs. It was all for fun anyway. I ended up replacing these RCA jacks later on with some much better ones. But regardless, I just wanted to show the whole process. I don't want to fudge it at all. Let's see. So now we're just doing a whole lot of mounting, organizing. I believe right now I'm making sure I use some little twist ties and a couple, I don't even know what you would call them, the little wire mounts that I usually keep a little bag of them for when I work on actual arcade machines. It's just so I can do some cable management. I guess it's a good time to mention, I've worked on some whole machines before, like actual arcade machines, a bunch of different types. I couldn't even really begin to describe. But regardless, the point is that the hardest part about this build really was packing all these wires into such a tight space. I've never actually tried to condense down something this small or really take arcade machines and arcade hardware out to events before. Like, I've taken them to friends' houses, but never out to events. So in hindsight, there were some things I probably would have done differently with the box if I would have known I was going to be filming it, putting it in the video. But regardless, when I first initially started this build, nothing was scripted, but I had like a list of features that I wanted, not so much for myself, but for the players in the area. I wanted a readily accessible reset button, a coin button, just in case I wanted to put it on a coin mode. Since when you put Third Strike into event mode, like the tournament setting where after every round it just goes back to character select, it doesn't track the wins the same way as it does in a coin mode. So I wanted the option. I wanted multiple video signals on the back, so that way if I wanted to, like I said, I have 2 component outputs on the back, so I can have 2 different CRT TVs back to back, so I can do like a faked head-to-head style setup, like a Versus City cabinet. I've only ever done that with friends so far. We haven't done that at an event, but one day I think we'll give it a shot, and I'll try to get some footage of that. It'll be fun. And I had those audio jacks as well. That was, again, a really important part of the build for me. It hasn't gotten as much use yet as I thought that it would, but again, going into this, I was building it more so for the players that are, you know, maybe a little bit more dedicated to being great at the game than I am, and I respect that a lot. I just want them to have the best options is the thing. So here we are wiring up all of our RCA jacks on the back, and all of these RCA ports have both a signal that we have to solder onto and a ground that we've got to solder as well. So it's just a lot of very small, meticulous, time-consuming soldering, not a lot going on here. Oh, I guess this is probably a good time to mention going forward. Those undammed decoders, it was kind of an afterthought as I was building this, because I've used the undammed decoders before, but I've always just used the USB port. So when I was planning on mounting these into the shells, my thought process was, oh, I'll just use the screw terminals and the USB port. And it wasn't until I got halfway through the build that I told myself, you know, I probably could have bought the little 4 or 5 pin header, and then the whatever it is, the 20 pin header or something, so I wouldn't have to use either of those. So I really don't have any excuse for not using the headers. I legitimately just didn't think about it. I totally blanked on that. Oh, that I didn't even talk about that yet. There's a little, you might be able to see it, it's a little bit small. There's a small green board underneath the JROC encoder in there. That is actually a JROC sync cleaner. I've never even attempted to use the JROC board on anything I've done before without that sync cleaner. In a nutshell, every arcade PCB on top of the RGB video has a separate line just for the video sync. And again, in a nutshell, it's going to help keep all of our colors inside the lines. It's going to keep the screen from going crazy. It's going to make sure everything for our picture stays, quote unquote, in sync. Yeah, just some more RCA wiring here. this took a little bit of time. It was just very, very meticulous. And again, it's just a small space, which is, you know, annoying. But more so than anything, again, it's tough to work in this small of a space for this kind of thing. So, you know, I could haphazardly just solder all this together and just cram it all in the box if I wanted to, but you'll see me multiple times throughout this little montage unsolder things, tuck things under boards, add, you know, zip ties and cable organizers and mount those into the box in an attempt to try to keep things organized. So it's starting out a little crazy, but over time I keep going back and adding things to help organize it along the way. Oh, and I guess for those of you that have used this J-Rock board before, you may be wondering why I didn't desolder the RCA jacks over there. Truth is, in the actual filming of this, I actually did start to unsolder them, but as I decided where to mount it into the board, I don't think it's this part. It might be a little bit later on, but if you constantly watch it, you'll see that I use one of the RCA jacks on there, and I zip tie a wire to it, I think, just to like try to keep it organized and stable, because I have a little harness going from like the very bottom of that board, I think, or maybe it's on the side, and it loops directly up into the component jack, or maybe it's like over into the S-Video jack. Point is, I kept it on there because I figured I could use it for organization, because the RCA jacks on that board, the ARM board jacks, are like pressed right up against that wall of the box, so it was like a nice little convenient thing to zip tie things to. That and I do not like I guess I don't know the relevance of this to some people, but you know, I really don't like using any kind of hot glue in these sorts of projects or builds. I know that some people are advocates of it, and in some small circumstances, if you're using it to just, you know, like if you make a little solder connection onto a board and then a little bit farther down the wire you want to add like a small gob just to you know, I guess relieve some tension on a wire, okay, but I want to do everything in my power just to either mount things down, keep things organized in some kind of physical non-hot glue way. Yeah, zip ties and cable mounts are typically my answer. Ooh, and thus begins bringing in the JAMA harness, and this was indeed the stuff of nightmares, and sadly probably the most fun part of it all, I guess, because this is really where it all kind of starts to come together. I mean, you could argue that, you know, having all the RCA jacks mounted in and the drilling done and whatnot is that culmination, but I'm looking to play something. I want to see it work. There's just a lot of wires here, that's all it is. A lot to organize, a lot to try to attempt to keep myself sane with. So yeah, we're just starting out from one row and working our way down with this. I believe right there you just saw me put a little piece of green heat shrink tubing over my 12-volt line for this, and now I think I'm doing the same with another 12-volt, and we'll get to some 5 volts a little later. Some people I know greatly prefer using the same color heat shrink on the same color wire, and you'll see me use like a blue and a green for my yellow 12 volts here. I am a much bigger fan of using distinct colors for heat shrink tubing, so that way I can very distinctly remember what is heat shrinked and what is not. And here I'm just powering some things on since I have power, and checking to make sure everything is kind of turning on and working. Just checking voltages up at the front, making sure everything's still looking good. There we are, so it's powered off, unplugged, and we're back to wiring. But yeah, much bigger fan of using distinct colors for heat shrinks, so I know if something has been heat shrinked. I've worked on other cabinets in the past where I've soldered something, heat shrinked it with the same exact color as the wire, and totally forgot it was heat shrink, and either snipped it down the line or accidentally tugged it the wrong way, and it just came totally undone. So I prefer using much better heat shrink, or a much different heat shrink, excuse me. I believe now we're bringing in my RGB lines. Yeah, should be. And you might have seen either earlier or right now, I have my phone off to the side and I'm just kind of checking back up on exact JAMA pinouts along the way. I already have everything organized with that little painter's tape that I've written some notes on, but I'm much prefer to just do things the better safe than sorry way. I've worked with JAMA harnesses a whole awful lot. I kind of have a good guess as to what everything is, but I'd rather not be wrong and accidentally wire up a 5-volt line to some, player 3 button and start seeing some smoke down the line. Yeah, trying to keep things a little bit more organized. And right now we just kind of have everything laying on top, so I can test some things out, make sure it's all working. But towards the end, we'll mount some things down along the inside of the case and route things underneath the power supply as well. Yeah, and again, we are totally axing an RGB option on this Supergun case. I just think it's much more practical to do that for something that I'm taking to and from events. More so in the sense of, like, if something goes wrong, like let's say, God forbid, I don't know, I lose a component cable. Like I forget or I lose a component cable. Okay, where's the nearest Walmart? Let me go buy a component cable. If I were to forget my SCART cable back at home, I really don't want to have to drive like another hour or 2 hours back home to go get the SCART cable. And there's no way here in the US I'm going to be able to go to my local supermarket and pick up an extra SCART cable for a Supergun. That and PVMs and BVMs, super expensive, especially nowadays. Like, unless you just know a guy or you have a source. But for most people that want to get into it, they got to buy one. And God forbid if you want to get it shipped, it's expensive. And then on top of that, God forbid something happens to it and you have to replace it. It is not cheap. So we just opted for component composite S-Video. It gets the job done just fine. For retro consoles, arcade games, like, I'm not trying to advocate that like RGB is bad by any means. Like, RGB really is like the absolute best video format you can get for these things. But again, for equipment that I'm taking to and from events quite literally every week, I just don't think it's all that practical. You don't really need it, Like, I think at that point, if I'm gonna bring out, a BVM and very specific hardware all the time, something that isn't as practical to replace, I may as well just drag a candy cabinet out to events, But either way, it's just all in fun. How can I get more people to play Third Strike easily? That's the goal. So now I've got some things powered up. I've got all the crucial JAMA parts wired up, including my kick harness out there on the side, and I'm starting to wire up the first undammed decoder. And here we're doing some video tests. Everything's looking pretty good. Pictures coming through just fine. But we have a little issue here. On my J-Rock board, if you take a good look at cinematic zoom, we're missing a color. There's no blue. Oh no. But if you look here just a minute, I start to kind of press down a specific part of the board, and it comes back in. That's not good. This board's old, okay? This board, I think, came out in like 2004, 2005. So like A, it's old technology, and B, I've hung on to it for a while. So there's a specific like surface mount resistor on here that is attached to the blue line, or in series with like the blue pod, I think it was. And it just didn't have a very solid connection to the pad under it. So just reflowed a little solder, and we're good to go. That's footage of the component signal after that little fix, and it looks just fine. And also with this little J-Rock board, it's got some missing features on it, I guess I should say, where you can't really collapse the image at all. You can't adjust the picture size, so it's kind of like what you get, which is what you get. And for some TVs, some signals just kind of won't go through. Like for this specific TV, I can't use the composite signal, but for one of my other CRTs and a couple others, they work just fine. So it's kind of a toss-up. But still, much easier to find another CRT TV with, composite at my local thrift store than it would be to find a PVM, BVM, etc., etc. Oh, and in that last clip, just in case you were wondering, I had most of the undammed converter wired up because I was just making sure the video signal was working, but I think I was missing like strong and fierce out of player one side. So I was trying to see like what kind of combos I could do with Ryu with just like I think roundhouse, low forward, and jab. So yeah, I'm gonna go for jump roundhouse, low forward, jab DP Shinku. Of course. Why would I not? Okay, it's all kind of starting to come together here. And I think, what are we doing next? I think we're working on the amplifier next? Yeah, we're taking off some of those weird pots from the amplifier. I forget exactly what the name of that part is on that amplifier mixer there. It's not specifically a potentiometer, those little dials. It's something else more specific. But the more that I thought about it, I was going to desolder these and run some detachable wires out to the side of the case so players could control the volume on the headphones independently. But the more that I thought about it, I decided to just leave them at like a decent volume, like loud but it won't hurt you volume, and let players not touch it. More so because I didn't want to run into drilling a hole in the side of the box, giving players the option, and then somebody, cranking it up to max, unplugging their headphones, the next poor guy plugs it back in, like plugs in their headphones, and their ears blow up. So I decided to just leave it at a half decent volume and just let it be. Like the option is there, but nobody's hurting anybody along the way. And also the reason I went for an amplifier / mixer is because I have a couple different audio sources going out. I have two different left and right RCA ports on the back, and I also have two more 3.5mm jacks on the front of the case for headphones. And for some of you guys, if you've ever used like a 3.5mm headphone splitter before, like your typical headphone jack splitter, you may have noticed, like back in the day, depending on what you used it on, the audio quality would get, weaker or worse the more that you split it. So I have to use an amplifier with individual adjustments to make sure that I can run audio out to multiple places and the signal won't weaken at all. So that was very important to me. And that's something that I haven't really seen in a lot of different super guns. So I just thought it was a really neat part of the project to try to implement and try out. That and it's much easier with this PCB because Third Strike has those direct stereo RCA jacks leading out, so I can just wire those directly into the mixer. I just completely omitted wiring in the audio from the JAMA harness because that is just strictly mono audio. I don't really need it on any of the TV sets that I have that I bring out to events or with this box, so that was pretty convenient. I just clipped some spare RCA cables, stripped the ends, and wired them all into the machine. And we're kind of coming up to the grand finale here. Organizing some things, getting things as tidy as possible, routing some things under the power supply. And at this point I've already ordered and I'm sitting on some more parts for the next super gun build. I have some more ideas that I'd love to implement for like unique features. So this was a really fun one to build, and I'm so glad I've gotten so many of my local players to use it. More than anything, I'm really excited for the next project. Some more stuff lined up, so we're just about finished up. We're just putting the case back together, mounting it back down, and let's look at some gameplay here soon. Warlord, yeah. Awesome. And my audio's there. That's it. Well, that's just about everything. Everything's all put together, it works, and outside of the replaced RCA jacks I'm going to show off in just a minute here, build's pretty much done. Everything's working just as it should, and plays great. Just having fun with some Warzard here. I did just want to give a quick note, though. Again, this is not supposed to be a tutorial on how to build this exact supergun. I just thought it would be fun to kind of show some of the work that goes into putting together some of these arcade projects. And for some of you that have local scenes where you have some people that bring out superguns to play some of these games, you can kind of see some of the work that goes into it. I did want to mention, before we kind of move on though, if you are thinking about building a supergun, this is not your first project if you're like brand new to soldering and that kind of thing. Start much smaller than stuff like this. Again, it's not meant to be a tutorial or anything like that, and it can be very dangerous to mess around with high voltage things and power supplies and expensive PCBs like Third Strike. Please do not ruin that hardware if you pay all that money for it, you know? There are safer off-the-shelf superguns that you can buy, but even then you still have to wire up power supplies, and that can be dangerous. So please, if you go to build a supergun for yourself, do your research. Just stay safe about it. But anyway, let's get to the real fun part. Let's find some people to play with. And our very first stop with the supergun is going to be Carolina Clash Rebirth. This was the first event I brought the supergun to, but this is also the first time they ran the event at their new location. Funny enough, the same weekend that this was happening, I was taking one of my little long weekend like mini vacations up to Greensboro to go see a friend of mine, and we were just going to go to Lost Ark for a while to play some Third Strike. But I got the supergun there with me. And we were just gonna playtest a little bit, kind of stress test the box a little bit before I really thought about taking it to any events. I wanted to see if there were any repairs I had to make along the way, things that could make it more stable. But then sure enough, Lost Ark ended up closing, and then we went back to my friend's house, and I get a ping on Discord that said, hey, CCR is tomorrow at the brand new location. And sure enough, they're running Third Strike. And I messaged the guy that was running Third Strike and I said, hey, just by chance, would you guys happen to have any interest in having an arcade setup at CCR? And of course, I got the message that said, yes, absolutely, sure. So I looked at my friend and I said, hey, you wanna drive an hour tomorrow to a tournament? Go play some Third Strike again? So that was a very spur of the moment decision, but I'm super happy they were up for having us. I was super up for bringing the hardware, they were super up for having me there to showcase it, and it was a really good time. But, of course, this is the first stress test, so not everything was perfect. Right as he activated Super 2, man, that sucks. So yeah, the PCB mount RCAs, not the greatest idea in the world. Then we had a couple issues with certain controllers people were using just not automatically mapping. I ordered some new decoders specifically for this build since my other decoders are still in a different pedestal. It's that pedestal that I use for the little gag dragging the arcade machine out. So I wanted to keep those in there, but I thought that since I was ordering new terminals, they would ship with the newest firmware. So that was totally my bad. I didn't flash them before this event. But quick supercut of all the different repairs and we'll get back to it. And not gonna lie, this actually kind of sucked. because I had to desolder all the old junky RCA panel mounts, or PCB mounts, and solder in the new panel mounts. But my soldering iron decided to die on me as soon as I started on this, which is awesome. It just wasn't picking up heat at all anymore, which was great. So the other thing was that not only was I out a soldering iron, or at least my good one, but I had another event that I was planning on taking this to literally the next day. So I had to use kind of a cheaper, junkier one in the meantime. That's why you're seeing me use a different one here. But hey, it got the job done, so I'll take it. Whatever works, we move on. And we're just about to close up shop, and we're all finished up. Back to the locals. So on our next stop, we're at a different local. This one is called Monday Fight Club. This is actually a weekly. This is something that I've been going to almost since they've started recently. And it's been a really, really great time. The Third Strike scene there is pretty regular, and every single time that I've gone back, there's been some new people hopping in every time. So it's been pretty freaking amazing. Namely, I want to take this time to kind of talk about some of the importance of locals, some advice on attending events and tournaments, and some advice on improving in the game in general. So while Third Strike is an amazing game, it kind of has a few issues in terms of getting new people in. For one, most people who are new to Street Fighter just hop right onto the newest one just because it's convenient, regardless of how good the older games are. Secondly, I think people might be a little bit overly intimidated by a couple things. For one, some people might put a little bit too much emphasis on not having the absolute perfect version to start playing on, so they just don't play at all. Don't let conversations about CRTs and tube televisions and sticks versus pads and input lag scare you off from trying the game. Yes, not building bad habits is extremely important in improving in Third Strike, but you have to play Third Strike for a long time before you should be worried about not having a perfect system and setup to play at the highest level. And secondly, people are a little bit too worried about getting stomped on by veterans of the game when they first start out. And the truth is, you probably will. But that's a good thing. And to be fair, that's gonna kind of happen in any new game that you pick up, regardless of if it's a fighting game. The reality is, as long as that good player is a decent person, you're pretty fortunate to have someone that good that you can play against. You should tell them that you're new after a few games and maybe even ask for advice if they're up for dealing that out. There's a right and a wrong time to do that though. If it's just a local like this where there's no real, quote unquote literal competition and there's no money on the line, there's no bad time to ask for advice. If you're in the middle of a tournament, however, and they just beat you in the first round, probably not the best idea to ask them how to beat their character. And on that note, tournaments are good for more than just being a competitive space. Listen, for all of the locals and the tournaments that are in my area, I am kind of fortunate to live in an area where there is a bunch of active Third Strike players, but I've still got to drive at least an hour out to get to any of these events. When I go to a tournament, yes, I'm trying to win, but more importantly, I just use tournaments as a space to find players. Tournament anxiety is a real thing with fighting games and with competitive games in general. However, easier said than done, just try not to stress over it. Use tournaments more as a space to find other people that play the game. Learn more things about the game. Also, there's an old saying with games like these and most old fighters and competitive games in general, in that if you want to get better, you have to fight the best people and just lose over and over and over again, and that's how you get better. Feel free to call me out, but I don't really agree with this sentiment. If you're really trying to improve as a player, it's better to play people that are at all skill ranges. You do need to play people that are better than you, both to see how high the skill ceiling is and how far you have to go, but you also have to play people that are at your level so you can start judging how far your improvements are coming along. Then in the same turn, it's good to go back and play people who may be a little bit newer than you, so that way you can see how far you've come and try to pass some of that knowledge along. The old adage in fighting games of playing the better person and just losing over and over to learn, while it can still be true, it's not really all that productive. And here's my reasoning. Third Strike is an old game. 1999 to 2000 is when it first came out, right? So someone who's a really good player in 2000, 2001 is going to play much differently than a really good player in the current year whenever you're watching this. Between 1999 and 2001, the skill gap between a brand new Third Strike player and a quote-unquote veteran Third Strike player was much smaller than it is today. If you're just starting out in whatever year you're watching this and some really good player in your area has been playing since the game first came out, they're gonna have that many decades of experience on top of those veteran 1999 good players. Playing the absolute best players in your area isn't going to be that productive to your growth as a player as it will be to play every single person who's interested in the game in your area. Playing every single person in your area that you can is going to help the skill and the knowledge grow in your area as much as possible. If you imagine two new players at a local, one of them knows how to tech a grab and the other one doesn't. One player that does know how to tech a grab is going to grab the other person over and over and over and win because of that. And yeah, they might be the best person in their area because of that, but imagine if they go to travel out to a tournament, or if someone new from outside of their area comes to visit their local, and they also know how to tech a grab. So now that very small advantage they had over their local scene is no longer relevant in the grand scheme of things. If you have knowledge to share, or if you're specifically winning because of some specific reason and the other person isn't realizing how they can beat your technique, if it's just a local and not a tournament, let them know. Help your scene grow along the way. If you can help the other people around you beat you, your overall scene grows stronger, and therefore you get better at the game because you have to work harder against them. Like if I do like a DP motion and do DP in between those 17 frames, I can not press anything on the stick and the DP will still come out as soon as the parry flash is over. So really, when people say they're going to buffer a parry, like if I'm walking up to you and I'm going to do like parry strong, I'm looking for the parry and then I'm going to let go of strong, wait until strong comes out, and then follow up with strong too. And all of this being said, this is assuming that you have people around you to go and play with. Online is a really great feature to have, and I'm not going to say you can't improve with it, but nothing is ever going to beat playing games with real people. So if you have a nearby arcade with Third Strike, or if you've got a local scene for Third Strike, go check it out sometime. Support it. If you can't actually go to the event, try to pop into their stream if they have one and just talk in the chat. If they have some kind of event page on Facebook, Twitter, retweet or repost the information for it. Yes, actually going to your locals is important for the local, but when people say support your locals, sometimes that doesn't always mean actually showing up to the locals. If you live a good distance away from some locals like I do, and you can't make every single one, if you are fortunate to have that many in your area, or even if you just can't make the one that you have all the time, you're still supporting your local by just reposting the information and the address for the event. Half the locals and monthlies and weeklies that I go to and I know about, I really would have never known anything about if it wasn't for some random person just reposting the information for it, or just some random person in the arcade or online going, hey, you play this game too? Have you heard of this event? And I've heard from so many people, oh, well, I can't go all the time, but if it's closer to you, you should definitely check it out. If you don't have a local Third Strike scene at all, look for a regular fighting game scene instead. If you got one, see what games they're playing. Chances are that, considering when this video is coming out, they're probably using PS4s. Get in touch with the tournament organizer and ask about playing some Third Strike. Just try to be as polite and cooperative as possible. Tournament organizers run a really tight ship most of the time, and schedules can be hard to keep steady at tournaments. The systems they have there might already have 30th anniversary installed anyway. If they can't take the time away from the tournament schedule, or they can't waste a setup, ask to bring an extra setup. Bring stuff yourself. If you bring your own setup, people will most likely ask for games. You know, I really wish I would have gotten footage of this, but at a specific Monday Fight Club I went to, the organizer there at this local, the dude just brought in a Dreamcast with Power Stone and screen with like some folding chairs. You bet I'm playing some Power Stone. I'm gonna take some time out of my day to play Power Stone, okay? And then after that, he said, hey, you know, I got Marvel 2. Yes, I'm gonna play Marvel 2. Put in Marvel 2. I suck at Marvel 2. But if you put up Marvel 2, I'll play Marvel 2. The point is that most people might be more interested than you think. If your local tournament organizer, or TO, is okay with you bringing an extra setup, just set up shop and play. Worst case scenario, you end up playing a round or two of arcade mode. But if you've got even 10 people there and you set up some Third Strike, I'd put my money on saying that you'll at least get a game out of someone. Just remember what I said about Third Strike being intimidating to some. If you're gonna light that fire and get some Third Strike going where you are, be inviting about it. Ask if they've played before, maybe who they play in newer fighting games, and try suggesting a character that they might like. If you know some things about that character, tell them a combo, tell them some important facts. Tell them what to look out for if they really get into the game. I mean, you never know, maybe someone who's been playing a new game is really experienced in Third Strike, but just doesn't play it at their local since it isn't a current game, or there aren't enough people interested. You might not have any idea who's at your local scene. You might have a Guilty Gear local with a handful of Super Turbo veterans, but no one is playing Super Turbo just from a lack of new player interest. And vice versa, if you're going to locals or if you're going to a tournament, this is a great time to check out other games too. Listen, I'm not trying to fool myself. We're kind of past the days where arcades were everywhere, but for fighting game players, locals and tournaments are your arcade. This is your chance to meet new people, meet new players, and try new games. You'd be surprised at how much you can learn and improve in your main game by stepping away and trying something else for a little while. And since you're going to be going anyway, don't worry about doing well at your first tournament. If you do, that's awesome, congrats. But if you don't, that's kinda FGC tradition. Absolutely everyone has to work through that tournament anxiety. Playing some sets for fun and playing in a tournament setting are two totally different feelings. If you gotta hold an L, that's not a loss, that's a lesson. Take every match as a learning experience. Try to slow down and think about what you did when they caught you, or what they did after you caught them. There's something to take away from every match, no matter what the outcome is. Just as a little personal advice, here's a couple things you can try to make sure you do before your tournament to ease some of that anxiety. For one, it all starts the day before. Make sure you get enough sleep if you can help it. I don't care how much you think grinding until 4 a.m. will help you for your 8 a.m. pool. I'll always put my money on better sleep, better focus. And no, that's not coming from somebody who's been to a ton of top 8s, but it is coming from someone who's been to a ton of tournaments and definitely knows the difference between feeling totally ready for anything and anyone and feeling like total trash as soon as you walk into the venue. Also, it's always going to be better to show up a little early for a tournament to save the TOs any struggle with scheduling, especially so if they're expecting a big turnout. Next, and maybe this is a little bit of a contradiction, but don't stray too far from your normal routine. How do you usually practice or play at home? How do you usually play at home or with your friends? The worst thing you can do is worry you're going to lose just because. I know I probably sound like a broken record by now, but we want to focus on forming good habits. And if we want to get good at this game, or anything really, don't try to drastically change your playstyle too much in the middle of a tournament just because you're in a tournament. Now is not the time to try out that brand new playbook or that fresh tech you read about on Twitter 5 minutes ago. Lastly, and this is a little bit more of a personal thing, try to network a little bit while you're there. If someone comes up to you and asks for some games, start a conversation. Like we talked about earlier, don't be afraid to ask about how they did that cool thing or how to block the cool thing. That is, if it's not in the middle of a tournament. Also, if you're lucky enough to have a modern arcade that hosts Third Strike, and especially if you have an arcade that's set to free play or on a pass system, don't be afraid to ask someone for games. Back in the day, you marked your turn in line for a game by putting up a quarter on the bezel of the cabinet, but now lots of arcades are moving to a venue fee system, and that's probably for the best. Now it's not uncommon to see two good players going round after round when they lose. It's good arcade practice to at least look around every now and again, see if anybody wants a game if they're too shy to say anything, but if you see them get through a couple games, say something. Ask if you can hop in for a round. I can't speak for everyone, but chances are they're willing to offer some knowledge. This is a niche game right now, and communities should always be accepting and inviting of new players. This is a very old, difficult game to get into, and it's only going to live on if new players continue to get into it. But at least for now, that's really all I've got to say about finding some locals, going to locals, attending tournaments, all that good stuff. So, if you've got a local Third Strike scene, or even just a local fighting game scene, go check it out sometime. I'm sure they'd be happy to have you. Go get some games in and just have fun.
Final challenge! Are you ready? Action!
So we're finally at the end of it all, huh? Man, if you really sat through all of part 1 and part 2 and, I mean, hey, even if you're here now at the end of part 3, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for hearing me out on so many different things. But since we're all the way here, I feel like it's only fitting to talk about how exactly I found Third Strike, and with that, how exactly I found Lost Ark. Just to recap, Lost Ark is a Japanese-inspired arcade out in Greensboro, North Carolina, and it's one of my absolute favorite places out here to go play Third Strike. But I didn't always live in North Carolina. I moved out to North Carolina, wow, man, I guess thinking about it now, it's been maybe a little over 4 years now, I think. Oh, and before we keep going, just as a little word of warning, this last little ending bit might get a little bit more cheesy than the rest of the video has been, so strap in for that. But anyways, ever since I was little and really like for as long as I can remember, I've been really into collecting retro video games. I used to be super huge into console collecting. Once I got a job somewhere in the middle of high school, I started gradually getting into arcade machine collecting and even restoring some arcade things along the way. Actually, it all kind of started with owning my first Sega Saturn. The only game that I had that came with it was Daytona USA, and I absolutely fell in love with that game. So after I had started working and I had a good couple paychecks, I told myself, you know what, maybe I should try to get a Daytona USA machine. Wouldn't that be fun if I can get a Daytona USA? And sure enough, I looked on my local Craigslist back where I used to live, and just by sheer coincidence, somebody was selling a Daytona USA Twin. That gigantic, complicated monster of a machine was my very first arcade machine. And I took that thing with me everywhere. And over time, I ended up picking up a couple more games along the way. I had a little Rolling Thunder / Street Fighter 2 conversion at one point. I had a little Double Dragon / Robotron, a Wizard of War that played TMNT, a bunch of cabinets and a bunch of projects. But we're gonna fast forward a little bit now that we're talking about some of my arcade machines that I had. I ended up running into a little bit of trouble with the people that I used to live with. I wasn't really super happy with where I was at the time, what I was doing with myself at the time, and I ended up moving to North Carolina, where I had some family. I kind of just packed up my whole life and headed out here. And I was pretty busted up after that. I'm really not sure of any way to describe how I was feeling other than just horribly depressed. I was in a really rough spot when I came down to North Carolina. There were just days where I just didn't want to get out of bed. I didn't want to do anything with myself. I had to drop off my whole life and all the people that I knew back where I used to live because I had to move down here. And it was tough just to do anything, really. I didn't really know what to do with myself. I mean, I got a job. I ended up trying to go back to school. It took a little while for me to just want to get out of bed, but I was having some pretty tough spots at that point. Some pretty tough moments. There was a positive though, coming over here. So I have this buddy named Chris that I've been talking to online since, man, I think like middle school. It's been a long time. And he actually lives out in Greensboro, North Carolina, conveniently, right next to Lost Ark. But he's my best friend. I've known the guy for forever. And when I moved down here, he was basically the only person I even really wanted to talk to. Chris is actually the same guy that made all the little cartoons of the GD character for this series. So, hey, thank you very much, Chris. From where I am, Greensboro is still a long, long trek away, so it's a bit of a voyage to get out there, but one day I had decided to myself, and after talking with Chris, I said, hey, let me make this trip and, finally hang out, talk, play some games. So I went up to go see Chris, and just me having a general interest in arcades, I asked him, hey, do you know if you have any, retro game stores, arcades around here? And he said he had no idea whatsoever. So after a really quick Google, we found that the arcade nearest to him was Lost Ark. And I can still remember my very first trip down there and exactly what I got too, because it's a little bit ironic to tell you the truth. I was mostly interested in the games at that point, just the regular console games. It was kind of hard for me to get myself motivated to get back into arcade machines, because I still had a very kind of closed collector mindset about the whole thing. We went to Lost Ark, and the scenery is great, and it still is, and all the employees that work there, they're super, super nice and friendly. And I remember specifically when I first went in there, they had a little TV that was pointing out of the window that was playing Splatterhouse, Wanpaku Graffiti. And this super, super sweet person named Kenzie was working the counter that day. And I remember we kind of had this back and forth conversation, and I asked her, hey, can I buy that Splatterhouse that's in the window? Because it's one of my favorite series and I wanted that game. And I think she actually called the owner, Dan, to see if she could sell the display copy to me, which, they did. They're freaking awesome people. Yeah, it's just like a business decision. They're still great people. Anyway, I ended up getting Splatterhouse Wanpaku Graffiti, and we went into the arcade, me and Chris, and they had such a great collection at the time. I think back when I went, they still had some American Nintendo machines, and I think even a couple pinball machines here and there. They hadn't gone full Japanese inspired just yet, but I remember all of this specifically because me and Chris had played some Street Fighter 2 and 3 that they had running, and after I finally got home after this whole trip, when I was still using Facebook a lot, I remember making this post, and I had a picture of the Splatterhouse cart and some other stuff that I bought from them, and I said in the post, finally got to go see Lost Ark video games in Greensboro, but there's just a few too many fighters for my taste. And I feel so stupid and embarrassed that I wrote that, seeing where I am right now and how much these games have affected me and grown on me. But to be fair, I loved it. I loved it more so as a store than anything else. It's just such a great place to be. Since it was such a long ways away for me to go to and from Greensboro and to go to see Chris, I couldn't do it all the time. What with work and school and finances, it's tough to make that kind of trip. I kind of just sunk back into that depressed state, just kind of wading through life as it was. I had a couple more low points, and I ended up kind of giving up on arcade games and retro games for a while. I just kind of wasn't enjoying myself and having fun with it anymore. I ended up selling off just about all of my cabinets that I had, all of my arcade games. I sold off a lot of console games on the side as well. Just kind of gave up on the whole thing. I was just really, really down on myself about it. And it was still a while after I finally sold off what was essentially the last of a lot of my games. There were two specific games that I ended up holding on to for a long time, and it was a Pop & Music and a Daytona USA, the first cabinet that I had. It was a little bit on the fritz. That hardware is pretty difficult to work with, in my defense, but I wanted to hang on to it just because it was my first arcade game. I loved it to death. Fast forward a little bit more, maybe only about a month or so after I sold off these games, and I went back up to Greensboro to go hang out with my friend again and just have a good time. That was, you know, kind of the only person that I wanted to talk to anymore at the time. I was kind of just so closed off from anyone and anything else besides like my best friend. That's it. But we went back up to Lost Ark because that was kind of turning into a little bit of a tradition. We sat back down with Third Strike and Super Turbo, Street Fighter 2 for a little while, and mostly Third Strike. I didn't really know a whole lot about ST and Third Strike and really Street Fighter in general. I'd played other fighters before this, but Street Fighter really wasn't my game before I found Lost Ark. And at some point, the owner comes up to us. Dan shows up and he plays some Third Strike, and he just destroys me. Like, mercilessly destroys me in Third Strike. And at this point, you know, this is only like my second trip to Lost Ark. I don't know anything about Third Strike or ST or really Street Fighter in general. All the fighting games I'd played before this were not Street Fighters, and they were very much just like a whatever kind of experience. Third Strike was just another arcade game there to me. That was it. But I ended up, you know, going to the other side of the machine after a couple sets, not knowing that the owner was playing, and I shook his hand, and I asked him if he'd been playing for a long time because he destroyed me, and I was just curious, and he told me like, hey, this is my place. And we just ended up talking for a little while in the arcade just about cabinets and games and how we started and found a lot of this stuff. And it was a nice little chit chat. It's always nice to find somebody who's into arcade machines as much as I am, and clearly he was way more into it than I am. You know, he's got this whole setup, he's got a place, but regardless, it's just a good conversation to have. But there's one sticking point to all of this that even to this day still kind of hits me in a weird way. I had asked him a little bit about Third Strike and ST and Street Fighter 2, because I didn't really know of the communities or anything at this point, and I asked him, you know, how much play do these usually get? And he tells me that Third Strike has a really good scene here, but he tells me that ST, Super Turbo, is the game that he really loves. He really, really likes Super Turbo. And I'm not sure what exactly it is about that conversation or the way that he talked about Super Turbo, but that conversation kind of just stuck with me for a while, in all honesty. Namely, after that trip, I ended up going home and I called up Chris, and this was so long ago I think like Skype was still relevant. We called him on Skype. And I called and I asked him like, hey, do you want to play this Third Strike game from Lost Ark? Do you want to see if we can play Third Strike here at home? And so we ended up setting up Fightcade, and I showed him how to set it up too, and we just played Third Strike for hours. And then hours turned into days, and days turned into weeks, and those weeks just turned into meticulous research and watching combo videos and learning about Street Fighter and the history and all of these different things, and I just absolutely fell in love with this game. And namely, when I started, I absolutely loved Makoto to death. I could not get over how Makoto played in this game. I don't know what it was, but something about the way that Makoto played in Third Strike just hit me so differently compared to every other kind of fighter that I've played before. I just loved the way that the game moved in general. So then I started taking more trips back and forth to Greensboro, and I got a little bit crazy with it at one point. I was going there Friday evenings after work, taking long weekends. I would go down there, pick up Chris, we would go down to the arcade, we would play all the way until they would close, and then I would just stay with him for a while, and then we would just keep going back and forth to the arcade. If there was a weekend where I wasn't able to stay with him, then I would go out Friday after work, stay there until they closed, drive all the way home, which is multiple hours, wake up the next morning just enough hours before they would open for me to make the trip, stay all day just to play Third Strike at the machine, and then drive multiple hours home, just do it again on the following Sunday. I absolutely fell in love with going to the arcade to play Street Fighter. For a little while, I really felt like I was living that weird mid-90s, early 2000s arcade dream dream where a lot of people that are a little bit more wiser, I guess is a good way to put it, than I used to live with arcades. That's just what I did. I went to the arcade to play Street Fighter. But the point that I really want to make here is that Third Strike and Lost Ark came into my life at a time where I really needed both of these things. The first couple times that I went to the arcade, I really wasn't all about seeing new people. I was there with my friend, I wanted to buy some games, I was trying to just play some games with my one friend and be out of there, that was it. But Third Strike and Lost Ark, the way that they have things set up, gave me more of a reason to like these games. I didn't want to just talk to my friend anymore. I still talk to him to this day. He's still my best friend. And I've always considered myself kind of a semi-extroverted person. I mean, I can put myself out there, keep conversations going, and well, I don't think I'd be making stuff for YouTube if I didn't think I could do that, but I found this absolute love of going to the arcade and just hoping some random person would show up so that way I could meet every new person that I can through the game. Finding and playing somebody at the arcade is such a unique experience compared to playing somebody over the internet. It's so ungodly special and different. You don't really know anything about the person on the other side of the machine when the message comes up that there's a new challenger. Sometimes it could be this person that's, you know, just hyped to be there. It could be this person that's having a rough day and they're taking out some aggression on the game. If you're playing someone and something really cool happens on the screen, you can hear them get excited on the other side. Or, you know, if you pull off a really cool combo, maybe they bang on the control panel and you can hear them get upset over at the other side of the machine. It's such a unique, amazing experience to meet people and see how they react and what emotions they put into the game. It's such a special experience going to the arcade. And I've met so many great people just showing up to Lost Ark and sitting down at the machine, and we play a couple sets and I go over, we shake hands, we talk about the game. It's really special the way that it works. And again, my best friend Chris, I met him over the internet, particularly in Xbox Live like forever ago. You can make friends just fine online and it can still be a special connection. But because I know how that works, I would hope that that gives me some merit when I say that I feel like meeting people through the arcade is such a vastly different experience compared to meeting people over games on the internet. And listen, I can hear all the old hats now saying, yeah, duh, it's an arcade, that's how it works. But look, there's two things to that, right? I came into arcades as a retro game collector, so this was already kind of my niche of game that I was already playing a lot at home. But more importantly, this wasn't really my generation's thing. I just came into it with an interest in this generation of games. Yeah, technically when I was little, I did go to some arcades, but even then, when I went to arcades, it still wasn't quite the era where Street Fighter 2 and 3 were huge, and debatably you can argue forever about when exactly Street Fighter 3 was huge in arcades, but we've already done all that. I very much came into arcades at that point where arcades definitely weren't what they used to be, but it was also a very strange middle ground. I came into arcades with a love of arcade games and machines, but I didn't realize that I had developed a love of the arcade culture until I lived it. But moving on, here's the thing. I loved going to Lost Ark so much. I thought that Lost Ark made me love arcade machines all over again, and I wanted to pour some more money into getting back into arcade machines and collecting and restoring, and for a little while I was pretty into that again. But over time, I kind of found that I wasn't really enjoying it how I thought that I was again. I thought that I was kind of slipping back into that, you know, rough spot. Since I had to dump more and more finances into getting these machines, then that meant that I wasn't able to take as many trips to Lost Ark as I wanted to. I couldn't go see my friend Chris, and I couldn't go to the arcade and meet new people, and that really kind of got me down on myself again. And I really wasn't sure why exactly I felt that way. So I ended up selling off some more cabinets that I had, and in particular, I ended up finally going back to Lost Ark after a couple more months, and I went to go talk to Dan again, and I told him that I was thinking about selling one of my last machines, and it was a Daytona USA. And I'm not sure if he knows or if he knew at the time that was my very first arcade machine, but that was a really big deal to me that I had decided to sell my Daytona USA. I was really stuck on that game. I had carried that around with me for forever, even though it's pretty banged up and it had some hardware issues. I carried it around for forever because that was just my first machine. Dan was actually interested in buying the game from me, but I felt like it was right. And I thought, you know what? Lost Ark has really done so much for me. I would be okay if that machine went to Lost Ark in some capacity. So he picked up the Daytona, life goes on, I ended up going back down to Lost Ark. I always try to go down there as much as I can, and I can't really tell you when exactly it hit me. I finally kind of had this revelation with Lost Ark that I told myself, you know, I don't think I really like arcade collecting and arcade games just for the collector sense of it, or for the value, or for the rarity, or anything like that. Most of the games that I ever bought, I got them because they were fun games and I wanted to own them and play them. The thing that I really learned to love about arcade games was that they're games that were meant to be played in a public space. They were games that were always meant to be played with other people, even if they were just single-player games. I mean, if you think about games like, you know, Donkey Kong, Miss Pac-Man, you know, whatever, those classics, they still had high score tables. They were still meant to be played in public spaces with other people around you. Even if they were single-player experiences, they had a community mentality built into them, even if it was a for-profit thing. What I really liked about arcade games was how it brought people together and how it could introduce people to each other in this really special way. It was actually Lost Ark's 8th anniversary recently, since they originally opened. They've had 2 different locations over the course of them being open. I never saw the original, but what I can say to those of you who have been to Lost Ark or have seen it before, I have been going since before the sheets. And if you know what that means, then you know what it means. But regardless, I've had a lot of time to think about Lost Ark and kind of everything that it's done for me since I came down here. All the new people that it's helped me meet, and the really crappy places that it's kind of helped me get out of before, and even being able to find a new love in the hobby that I already thought I loved so much. So throughout this entire speech that I've been giving you here, you've kind of been watching me fight this queue for a little while. For those of you that frequent Lost Ark, you might have already guessed it, but this queue is actually Dan, the owner of Lost Ark. And this was the very last trip that I actually took here before editing this specific part of this series. And this might not be true for forever, it's his business, but the monitor in the Poppin' music machine they have here is actually one of the exact same monitors from my old Daytona USA. At the end of the day, it's just a part. They can do with it whatever they want, but there's just something nice thinking about a small piece of my very first arcade machine still kinda lives on at my absolute favorite arcade. But when I shot this, it was just another one of those mini weekend vacations where I go down and I pick up my buddy Chris and we go to the arcade and we just play a bunch of Third Strike. Lost Ark has just kind of always been this rock to me in my life. It's a place where I can just go and be with my friend and play some games, and nothing else in the world really matters while I'm down there. I don't have to think about work or bills or life. I can just go down there and forget about all of it and just dump everything that I have going on and that I'm thinking about, and I can just pour myself into being in this space and playing this game and just loving what I'm doing. So, just in case you ever see this, Dan, Kenzie, everyone that keeps Lost Ark going, thank you so much for everything that you do, for having this space and maintaining it and keeping it afloat and doing so much for me and what I can only imagine is so many other people in my exact same kind of situation. Just thank you, Lost Ark, for everything. Here's to a happy 8th anniversary, and to hopefully many, many more. Well, that's about it. Wow, GD, another fade to black, and then you start talking again? I know. Shut up. But let's reel it in, let's get serious one more time. The very first episode of Enemy Comin is now in the books. But I've already got a lot planned for what exactly I want to do with Enemy Comin and with even more things on this channel. If you just listened to that whole rambling speech I did about Lost Ark, what I really want to do with this channel is bring more arcade things out to people. I want to get more people playing these games, not only Third Strike, but some other more difficult to get into arcade games, or just find some new ways to play niche games. And even then, I'd still love to make more Third Strike stuff on top of that, which this is where I kind of need to ask you. In particular, what exactly did you think about the How to Play section of this series? I kind of structured everything to be a really huge jumping in video that you can watch if you're just now picking up 30th anniversary and if this is going to be your first kind of Street Fighter or fighting game. I had to start all the way with here's how you move, here's what a normal is, and then end off with okay, here's what a DED is and here's what SGGK is, so it's kind of cumulative, but I can't really cover everything unless I take hours and hours to do it. I'd love to go back and just maybe make one nice short video just talking about here's what a normal is, here's the basics, and then from there I can break things up and go into more character specific things. I'd love to make some stuff for maybe Makoto or Remy or really any other character in Third Strike. Even for Ken, there's still a bunch of stuff that I just couldn't talk about or squeeze into the time frame. We talked about a couple specific examples, but it's not like we talked about every single matchup in the game for Ken, and it's not like we talked about every single useful tool and situation in neutral that would be good for Ken players to know. There's so much more for Third Strike that I would love to make, and I'm really excited to get started on. And even outside of Third Strike, there's so many more arcade things I already have planned and I've been working on in between editing this video that I'm super excited to show you guys soon. But with that means you know what time it is. I gotta do the YouTuber stuff. So obviously, if you wanna see more videos by me and more stuff that I make in the future, you can hit subscribe, you can do whatever the bell thing is that works here. Just hit the subscribe button, hopefully things will show up for you. If you want more updates specifically with me and what I'm doing, what I'm working on, you can follow me over at Twitter. That's definitely the social media platform that I'm the most active on, so any kind of update, progress report, fun thing that I wanna talk about, it's gonna hit Twitter first. Even though it's a little bit barren right now, you can also follow me at this Twitch channel too. I haven't actually done any kind of live streaming in a really long time, but it's always been something that I've wanted to get back into. But here's the thing, right? In between editing stuff for this channel, building stuff, and making new arcade things to bring out to different kinds of events, and even filming for this channel and this series, I'm working a normal like 9 to 5 in between all this, so there's really no set schedule for when exactly I can build things, edit things, and definitely no set schedule for when I can stream. So if you ever want to hear about when I'm gonna be streaming or what I might be thinking about starting up soon, gonna go back to it, follow me over at Twitter. That's where you can hear all kinds of updates all about what I'm planning on doing. And on top of that, when I do start streaming, I'll probably post some kind of temporary video up to this YouTube channel and then take it down whenever the stream is over. So I guess there's another reason to follow and subscribe to me on here if you want to keep up with live streams, at least just for the notifications. I'd also like to give a huge thanks to Chris for making all the current artwork in this series. Here's his Twitter handle in case you want to go follow him as well. He's working on some really cool projects that I can't really talk about now, but I'm definitely excited to share with you guys later when he's ready. And also another massive thank you to Carolina Clash, Rebirth, Monday Fight Club, and Lost Ark for letting me come in and do a little bit of filming for this series too. But I guess that's about all that I got. Again, thank you so much for watching this very first episode of Enemy Comin. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that you learned something. I hope that you get out there and you either play some Third Strike or you find your local fighting game scene and you meet some really cool people. And I guess now, final words. Well, go to your locals. If you have a local arcade, support it. Send me all of your Mischief Makers carts, please. And play some Third Strike. It's a good game.